And I'm going to recognize myself now for 5 minutes to make an opening statement. I want to welcome all of the members, the witnesses, many guests in the audience to our second hearing on the deadly serious topic of the resurgence of violent white supremacy in America. Last month, we held a hearing to help us understand the scope of the problem, and we heard from a number of witnesses about the consequences of the government not acting to meet the threat, including from Susan Bro, the mother of Heather Heyer, who was the young woman killed by white supremacists in Charlottesville 2 years ago. We heard also from former FBI and Department of Homeland Security officials on what the agencies are doing today and not doing and should be doing in response. One message came through loud and clear at that hearing. White supremacists today constitute the most significant threat of domestic terror in the United States, but the federal government lacks a comprehensive and cohesive strategy for addressing the problem. Last month's hearing left me with three primary concerns. First, the FBI's data collection and reporting system at best drastically underreports hate violence in the U.S. and at worst deliberately obscures the scope of the threat. Second, the FBI's allocation of anti-terrorism resources is skewed to international terrorism, despite data showing domestic terror to be the greater threat today. And third, the Department of Homeland Security appears to have no overall strategic plan for how to counter and prevent white supremacist violence. It's my sincere hope that our friends at the FBI and Homeland Security who are here today are prepared to adequately address all of these concerns today. The FBI's data reporting on hate-motivated violence, both in the Criminal Investigative Division and the Counterterrorism Division, is flawed. Every witness before the subcommittee, whether invited by the majority or the minority, agreed on one thing: the FBI's hate crime statistics are inaccurate and do not reflect the reality of hate-motivated violence in our country. In numbers that are now familiar to us all, from 2013 to 2017, the FBI reported on average 7,500 hate crimes annually. During that same time period, the Bureau of Justice Statistics National Crime Victimization Survey estimated on average 200,000 hate crimes annually, which means the FBI is reporting one hate crime for more than 20 hate crimes that are reported in the National Crime Victimization Survey. There are data leaks in almost every stage of the hate crimes reporting process, from the hesitation of victims to report hate crimes to the police, to the failure of local and state police to report hate crimes to the FBI not reporting hate crimes that they are aware of and filling in for gaps in the record. What's more, the FBI's data excludes incidents that any reasonable person would agree should have been included. Perhaps the most prominent example was the murder of Heather Heyer herself in Charlottesville in 2017. Why was her murder not reported as a hate crime? The best that I can understand, this baffling omission reflects a problem first at the local level, as local police did not report it as a hate crime, but it also betrays a systemic feeling by the FBI, which apparently made little or no effort at all to audit its own statistics to independently verify the accuracy of the data being submitted from around the country. So that is inexplicable and unacceptable, and I know we can do better, and I hope we can hear from some of our witnesses about how we can make improvements. Mr. Shivers, I hope you're prepared today to lay out a detailed plan for how CID can improve the hate crime collection and reporting data. An entirely different issue appears to be plaguing the Counterterrorism Division. While CID lacks the information necessary to understand the scope of hate crimes, CID has detailed data on domestic terror, but seems determined to obscure the scope of white supremacist violence. For at least a decade, the FBI employed the relatively straightforward counterterrorism term white supremacist extremist, WSE, which is defined as groups or individuals who facilitate or engage in acts of violence directed at the federal government, ethnic minorities, or Jewish persons in support of their belief that Caucasians are intellectually and morally superior to other races. This official category from the FBI and Department of Homeland Security's joint lexicon was accompanied by at least 9 other specific categories, including anarchist extremists, animal rights extremists, anti-abortion extremists, black supremacist extremists, environmental rights extremists, homegrown violent extremists, militia extremists, sovereign citizen extremists, and racist skinhead extremists. But now the FBI has collapsed these prior 10 specific categories into 4 combined categories. It now uses 1, racially motivated violent extremism, which we have been told is an umbrella term that combines the prior subcategories for white and black racially motivated extremism. 2, anti-government, anti-authority extremism. 3, animal rights, environmental extremism. And 4, abortion extremism. What was the purpose of these changes? At what level of detail is the FBI still tracking extremist activity? What proportion of racially motivated violent extremism is actually perpetrated by white supremacists? Merging white supremacist extremists who were responsible for 39 murders in 2018 with black supremacist extremists who are responsible for 0 extremist murders in 2018 into a single amalgamated category called racially motivated violent extremism, I think obscures the real threat, but I would love to hear our witnesses opine on that. Similarly, the transformation of the descriptive anti-abortion extremist category, which was in place for a decade, into the misleading new category of abortion extremism is, it appears to me, a ham-fisted effort to disguise the nature of the real threat to women's healthcare clinics and doctors and nurses and staff who work there. I know of no women's reproductive health workers or pro-choice activists who are blowing up clinics or otherwise committing violence. We cannot play word games with domestic terror, nor can we afford to let hate crimes go drastically unreported. The FBI must collect and report accurate data on white supremacist violence and effectively measure the real magnitude of the threat. The government cannot protect vulnerable communities without understanding and defining the problem in accurate detail. Despite the obvious problems with the data, this much is clear. White supremacist terror is on the rise, and far-right and white supremacist domestic terror is a far more lethal threat to Americans in the United States today than is international Islamic terror. But the FBI's resource allocations don't reflect this reality. According to the Anti-Defamation League, from 2009 to 18, far-right extremism, which the FBI classifies as a form of domestic terrorism, was responsible for 73% of extremist murders. Islamic extremism, which the FBI usually classifies as a form of international terrorism, was responsible for 23% of the fatalities during that period. However, the FBI has testified the Bureau allocates its resources almost exactly backwards from what the problem would suggest, devoting 80% of field agents to stopping international terrorism, including Islamic extremism, and only 20% to stopping domestic terrorism, including far-right and white supremacist extremism. This allocation of resources, or misallocation of resources, has real-life consequences. As George Salim testified at our last hearing, the University of Maryland START Center found that from September 11th, 2001 through 2017, approximately 71% of Islamist-inspired extremists in the U.S. were interdicted. They were stopped in the planning phase of terror activity. But with far-right extremists, the inverse is the case, and over 71% managed to successfully commit violent acts they were planning. How many far-right extremist attacks could have been prevented if we had taken that threat as seriously as we had taken the threat of Islamist fanatical extremism? According to the Anti-Defamation League, of the 50 domestic extremist murders committed in America last year, every perpetrator had ties to right-wing extremists, and 78% of the murders, or 39 of them, were committed by white supremacists. Meanwhile, there were 0 killings in 2018 related to left-wing extremism, a category which includes crimes committed by anarchists and black nationalists. How many lives can we save if we strengthen and focus our response on white supremacist violence? Mr. McGarity, I hope you are prepared to account for CTD's statistical reporting and resource allocations. The FBI is not the only piece of the puzzle. We also need to hear from the Department of Homeland Security to answer a fundamental question. Do we have an overall strategic plan to counter and prevent the threat of white supremacist violence? I fear the answer is no, but I'm very eager to hear from Ms. Newman. News reports indicate that this administration is actually dismantling DHS's threat prevention framework for domestic terror without a clear path forward to replace the existing framework. George Salim, who testified at our last hearing, was the Homeland Security Director of Countering Violent Extremism Task Force, and he testified that when he was at the Office of Community Partnerships, he oversaw the Countering Violent Extremism Task Force. They had $10 million in grant funding to give away. They had 16 full-time employees and 25 contractors and a total budget of $21 million to try to do proactive work to counter the spread of terror. Now, after the office has been renamed and reorganized to the Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention, there are only 8 staff and a budget of $2.6 million. So the staff has been cut in half, and they've lost 80 to 90% of their funding. This development appears to have been aimed, well, it's not clear exactly why it happened, and I hope you can shed some light on that for us, Ms. Newman. In testimony prepared for today's hearing, Homeland Security appears to lay out a plan for the path forward, but I think Ms. Newman would agree that there are still more questions than answers at this point. What are the office's precise functions? Who's in charge? How many personnel will be assigned to prevent white supremacy, violence? What is the budget? There's no clear answer. And it's very late in the game for us. The massacre at the Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston was in 2015. Heather Heyer died in 2017, where there were another 30 or 35 crimes committed during those horrific events in Charlottesville. The Tree of Life massacre took place last year. Why are we now just getting around to establishing an office to address the threat? Why are we just now trying to articulate a nationwide strategy to prevent this threat to communities across the land? I know that Ms. Newman recognizes the enormity of the problem and the importance of getting it right, and I look forward to hearing her thoughts about a detailed strategic plan moving forward. President Trump has called white supremacists a small group of people that have very, very serious problems. But real statistics from third-party groups and his own law enforcement agencies demonstrate that it's actually a rather large group of people in the thousands, and they are causing very, very serious problems, not just for themselves, but for everybody else, and certainly for everybody who has died at the hands of white supremacists across the country. In Congress, we must ensure that the government step up immediately, speak clearly about the nature of this threat, and rapidly move to increase and improve law enforcement and public education efforts to protect our communities against the lethal perils of white supremacist violence. And with that, I'm delighted to turn it over to the distinguished ranking member of the committee, Mr. Roy.